I've spent days watching what top IELTS tutors recommend, and I found out which advice actually works. I call this the strategy that all examiners would agree is the best for describing a bar chart. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to start your report, how to structure your response so it's easy to follow and hits all marking criteria, what to write in your overview paragraph, how to find the most important trends in a bar chart, and of course, I'm gonna share some strategies and vocabulary you can use. So by the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to achieve the highest score for your writing task 1. So grab your pen and paper to take some notes and let's dive right in. Alright, before we even look at our bar chart example, I need to explain something really crucial, and this will determine whether you get a band 5 or a band 7 and above. And this is your report structure. Now, your score is an average of 4 criteria. So each criteria weighs 25% of your overall score. Task achievement, coherency and cohesion, lexical resource, that's your vocabulary, and grammatical range and accuracy. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you don't have an overview, you get 5 for task achievement. If you have an overview, that's band score of 6. If you have a clear overview, that's band score 7. So your band score will go up depending on your overview. And you're also being tested on paragraphing and how well you organize your information. If you only use one paragraph in your body and there is no logical progression, you'll get 5 for coherency and cohesion. Are you with me so far? Let me give you an example. If you score 7 for vocabulary and grammar, but you got 5 for task achievement and coherency and cohesion because you didn't include an overview and haven't organized your response, your overall score is going to be 6. But in contrast, a student who scored 6 for vocabulary and grammar, but 7 for organizing their thoughts and including overview will get 6.5, even though they scored less for vocabulary and grammar. And that's crazy, because writing is one of the hardest parts of IELTS, but we know that it's possible to get a good score without using sophisticated vocabulary and grammar. And 6.5 will get you into most UK universities. Okay, but how do you structure your response so it's easy to follow and hits all the marking criteria? You must have an introduction, an overview, and 2-3 paragraphs where you provide more detail. You can write your overview after the introduction or at the end of your report. I prefer to have it after the introduction because, it's more logical to go from general information to more specific detail. By the way, you don't need a conclusion. You're required to write an overview. If you include a conclusion, you'll likely repeat information that you already mentioned. And that breaks cohesion and logic. So don't repeat your points anywhere else in the report. Okay, but where do we start? To be honest, it's very simple. Read the task and summary first. The first thing we need to do is to paraphrase the introduction. Our example introduction says, the bar chart shows the different methods of transport used by commuters to travel to work in Cambridge city centre in 2010, 2015 and 2020. Take a second. What would you write if this showed up in your test? Here's how I would paraphrase it. And I guarantee everyone can do this easily. The bar chart illustrates the various modes of transportation used by commuters traveling to work in Cambridge city centre over a decade with a data presented for the years 2010, 2015 and 2020. So all I did was replace a bunch of words with their synonyms. I changed shows to illustrates. You could also use depicts, presents, displays, demonstrates, provides information about. Then I changed different methods of transport to various modes of transportation. I also use a gerund to change to travel to work to traveling to work. And lastly, I changed in 2010, 15, and 2020 to over a decade with data presented for the years 2010, 2015, and 2020. That's all you need to do to paraphrase your introduction. But here are some more techniques that are worth mentioning. For example, using how. This is frequently used when we talk about changes. For example, the bar chart shows changes in population growth over time. The line depicts how population growth has changed throughout the period. You can also change word order. For example, the bar chart compares the main reasons for immigration in 1990 and 2020. A comparison of the primary migration factors in 1990 and 2020 is presenting in the bar chart. And the last popular technique is changing active voice to passive voice. For example, the table shows the percentage of people who use the internet. The percentage of people who use the internet is displayed in a table. Again, that's all you need to know to effectively paraphrase any introduction. And if you practice it for an hour, trying different techniques, I guarantee you'll have no problems with paraphrasing the introduction in your test. Now, some tutors recommend writing an introduction from scratch without looking at the summary. They justify it by saying that sometimes students can't think of a way to make a summary better. But in my opinion, you don't need to make it better, you need to make it different. So I'd stay away from this advice and work on my paraphrasing. Because you only need to know how to change word order and some synonyms. It's a lot easier and faster than writing an introduction from scratch. Now, we're moving on to the most important part, which is the overview. What do we need to write an overview to get the maximum score? You always begin with phrases like overall, in general, or it is clear that. And the reason why you want to start with any of these phrases is because it clearly shows the examiner that this is your overview. For your overview, you want to include 2 to 4 main trends and patterns. But it is important that you avoid including specific figures. This is a very common mistake that students make. You don't want to repeat yourself because you will lose points for your coherence and cohesion if you do that. Save this information for your detailed paragraphs and only talk about general trends. How to find the most important trends in a bar chart. The number one strategy is to look for extreme values. You need to identify the highest and lowest values in each category and also which categories show the maximum or minimum figures. These are the key features that examiners want to see in your report, and this works specifically well for bar charts that show comparison. However, our example chart is different because it shows changes over time. You can draw a line and see that this bar shows a trend, so it acts more like a line chart. For these type of charts, the best strategy is to identify significant changes over time. So we're looking for increases and decreases. Looking at this chart, what stands out first to you? Focus on big changes as well as similar trends and patterns. For example, for public transport, we can see that it has an upward trend, as does cycling. Private car shows a downward trend, and walking and taxis remained relatively stable. When dealing with a trend chart like this one, you often want to omit the middle part because when discussing a trend, you focus on where you started, in our case 2010, and compare that to the latest figures, 2020. So it's absolutely fine to skip the middle part. Here is an example overview. Overall, there were significant changes in commuting patterns during this period. Public transport and cycling showed substantial increases in popularity, while private car usage declined considerably. Both walking and taxi usage remained relatively stable throughout the decade. Not so bad, right? Let's look at the vocabulary I used in this overview. Are there any words that you're not familiar with? If you know all of these words, then you're probably fine and you can craft a similar overview. But if there are some words that you're not sure about, then I encourage you to write them down and memorize them. The language we use to describe charts is always similar. You don't need to know any special language. You need to use number language. I use significant and substantial, which means exactly the same. It used to describe something big, important, or noticeable. I also use noun increases to describe an upward trend. You can also use the verb increase and say public transport and cycling increase in popularity. To describe a downward trend, I use the verb decline, followed by the adverb considerably, to show that the decline was big and noticeable. And to describe numbers that remain the same, I use the phrase remained relatively stable, which means that there were no big changes when comparing data throughout the period. Isn't it interesting how just a few words can change the tone of a sentence? Now, in the next paragraphs, we're going to provide more information and detail, and this is important because if you don't support the information in your report, you'll score 5 for task achievement. Remember, in the overview, we give more general information of what we're seeing on the graph. And in our detailed paragraphs, this is where we provide more detail. We give numbers and essentially compare these numbers between categories or different times. We want to show the examiner that we can use the language to describe changes. This is why I purposefully chose a chart that contains 3 different trends to demonstrate the vocabulary and grammar that I use to describe these 3 different scenarios. In my example, I used 3 paragraphs to describe this data. Always remember that you need to use the optimum number of paragraphs to logically structure your report, which means if you can group this category in half, then use 2 paragraphs. If you divide them in 3 parts, then use 3 paragraphs. Don't use 1 paragraph because you need to show the examiner that you can use paragraphing skillfully. And in order to do that, you need to know how to group the categories. In my example, I grouped them by trends, and I can see 3 different trends: an upward trend and a downward trend, and categories that remained relatively stable. You can also group categories in your report based on highest and lowest values, which is a very common and effective strategy. Just remember that the key goal here is to present the information logically. Now, after we've grouped our data, we know that we need to write 3 paragraphs. But how can we make sure that we compare the groups and numbers without repeating ourselves and show a wide range of grammar and vocabulary? So, what would you include in categories showing an upward trend? Here is an example for the first detailed paragraph. Looking at the data in more detail, public transport experienced the most dramatic growth, rising steadily from 45% of commuters in 2010 to 62% in 2015, and further increasing to 78% by 2020. This represents a total rise of 33 percentage points over the decade. First of all, we want to demonstrate that we can transition smoothly between paragraphs using linking phrases. In this example, I used looking at the data in more detail. Just from simply reading this linking phrase, the reader knows that this paragraph is going to dive into more detail. Then, we want to talk about the key feature that we noticed. In public transport experienced the most dramatic growth. I described the biggest growth across all the categories using a superlative, the most dramatic. Following that, I started to provide the numbers for each time period. I used rising steadily and further increasing. Notice how I use the past tense because we're talking about a time period in the past. And then I summarized by saying this represents a total rise of 33 percentage points over a decade. Similarly, cycling showed consistent growth beginning at 22% in 2010, increasing to 32% by mid-decade, and reaching 48 by 2020, more than doubling its initial figure. Here's how I used another linker. Similarly, that shows that the upcoming information is going to be about another category that experienced a similar trend. And again, I went from describing the trend to more detail and then summarizing by comparing the beginning and the ending by saying more than doubling its initial figure. Are you starting to see a pattern here? We always move from general statement about trends to specific numbers, then summarize the change. Before we move on to the next paragraph, I want to pay attention to the vocabulary that I've used. I tried to use a wide range even though I was describing the same trend, I was describing an increase. Notice how some words can be used in noun form and verb form. For example, rising and rise. You also can say growth and grew, or increase and increased. This shows flexibility and a strong command of a language. Also notice how I used adjectives to describe the changes: dramatic, substantial, consistent. I also included adverbs like rising steadily. Try to remember these collocations because, again, you don't need to know any special language. It's just number language, and it's going to be the same when you're describing any data. For grammar, I used a mix of simple, complex, and compound sentences in active voice. Also, I not only used percentages but also said percentage points, as well as proportions like doubled. You can also say grew by 100%. When you want to demonstrate a wide range of vocabulary, try to pay attention to the rate of the change because you can always add nice adjectives and adverbs. Also, compare a category to other categories and use superlatives or comparisons like more than X% or the biggest growth. Now, let's look at the next paragraph. In stark contrast, private car usage declined markedly throughout the period examined. In 2010, private cars were most popular commuting method at 65%, but this figure fell to 55% by 2015 and decreased further to 42% by 2020, representing a 23 reduction overall. Here I used a similar structure. First, I used a linker to nicely transition to my new paragraph by including in stark contrast. I'm telling the reader that the paragraph is going to be about the opposite of the previous paragraph. Then I started with describing the trend of the private car category. Again, I used an adverb to show my vocabulary range. Then I moved on and provided more information and figures. I compared the private car usage to other categories and used the superlative. This category was the most popular commuting method, and then described the changes throughout the period. To wrap up the sentence, I summarized the data, saying that the overall change represented a 23 percentage point reduction. Again, the same strategy, but slightly different vocabulary because previously we talked about increases and growth. And now we talk about decline, decrease, and numbers falling. Let's look at our last paragraph. The remaining two categories showed minimum fluctuation. Walking as a means of commuting remained almost unchanged, with only minor variations from 35% in 2010, decreasing slightly to 33% in 2015, before rising marginally to 36% by 2020. To open this paragraph, I used a grouping language. I grouped the last two or the remaining two categories and explained the trend. The strategy remains the same. We describe a trend and then we go into the numbers. The only thing that I changed is the vocabulary. When we talk about fluctuations and stability, we can say that it remained almost unchanged with minor variations and decreased slightly before rising marginally. Again, these adverbs show very little insignificant change. Similarly, taxi usage showed negligible changes, hovering around 18 to 20% throughout the decade and ending at 19% in 2020. Again, I use similarly to group both categories with similar trend, and to describe the changes, I used adjective negligible and gave some numbers to support my findings. When you analyze the data, you can compare the details, numbers, and look for differences and similarities. If there is a difference, then you can say in contrast or as opposed to smoothly transition between groups or start a new paragraph. When speaking about similarities, you can say similarly to group categories that share a similar trend. Do you see how much easier it is when we break it down like this? Now, should you talk about all the numbers? The answer is no, you don't have to, especially when it comes to trend bar charts like this one. The main job is to find the biggest changes. There is nothing wrong with describing all the data, but sometimes these charts may be more complex and have multiple groups and multiple timelines. Focus on key features first. Remember that the word count needs to be at least 150 words. If you're aiming for band 8 or 9, then you need to go slightly over than that word limit, so aim at around 170, 180 words. And remember, you don't have unlimited time, so it generally comes down to your judgment. But as long as you're logical, include an overview, and use appropriate vocabulary, you're good to go. It's not as hard as many people think it is. You just need to spend a couple of days explaining charts and graphs because the language for all charts is exactly the same. Speaking of language, do you struggle to create long sentences? Here are a few strategies you can use to show the examiner your grammatical range. Similarly, cycling showed consistent growth beginning at 22% in 2010, reaching 48% by 2020, more than doubling its initial figure. Now, look at this sentence. Do you see how I was able to create a long sentence like this? Every single idea is connected by using a verb plus ing form. Beginning, increasing, reaching. Basically, we're combining some basic sentences to create a more complex sentence. Let me demonstrate with a simpler example. The runner completed the marathon. She broke her personal record. She celebrated with her team. The runner completed the marathon, breaking her personal record and celebrating with her team. You can see that the main action remained as the main verb, and then the secondary actions become participles. All these actions relate to the same subject, in this case, the runner. Another easier way to create more complex sentences is using conjunctions. Coordinating and, but, or, so, yet, for. The student had only studied for 2 weeks, yet he managed to achieve a band 7 on the writing section. Subordinating, although, because, since, while, as, even though, despite the fact that the candidate's score improved significantly as she incorporated more complex sentence structures into her writing. Correlative, not only but also, both, and, either or, neither nor. Candidates must either complete all sections of the test or risk receiving a significantly lower overall band score. Are you with me so far? Now, something very important. In my chart, I knew what each data point was because I created this chart myself. In your real test, you'll see a bar chart that is almost reaching a certain percentage. Then you need to add phrases like at, around, approximately, about, or almost, simply because you don't know the exact figure. The percentage of students who passed the exam nearly reached 80%, standing at around 78% by the end of the term. Housing costs almost doubled between 2010 and 2020, increasing to approximately 45% of average household income. By the way, there is one piece of advice that I came across a few times, even from popular tutors, that can hurt your score. It is when tutors recommend spending a specific time on each paragraph. For example, they might show you an example that requires only 2 detailed paragraphs and say spend no more than 5 minutes for each paragraph, so 10 minutes in total. This is not too bad of advice, but be aware that you want to be flexible. If it makes sense to have more than 2 paragraphs, then use 3 paragraphs so you don't lose points for coherency and cohesion. In that case, you definitely want to spend less time on each paragraph, otherwise you're wasting too much time, resulting in less time to complete writing task 2. I know talking about paragraphs doesn't sound exciting, but it's where you score big. So don't stick to a rigid formula and try to spend no more than 20 minutes on this task. Your writing task 2 contributes twice as much to your overall writing band score. Okay, but how many words should I include in each part? I don't want you to stick to a specific word count when it comes to paragraphing. Do what makes sense, but if you need something to reference against, a general rule of thumb is 30-40 words for your introduction, then 30-40 words for your overview, and around 120 words for your analysis paragraphs. So in total, you have around 180 to 200 words. For writing task 1, aim for between 170 and 190 words for the highest band. Again, don't try to artificially expand a paragraph if you feel like a paragraph is too short. What's important here is that your report is logical and coherent. And that's it. With these strategies, you'll be well on your way to achieving a high band score in your IELTS Task 1 writing. Also, I want to know who watched this video till the end, so write down in the comments hero because you're my hero. Yes, you, right there. If you like this video, you might also like this one where I share a strategy that will help you prepare for any question or cue card IELTS throws at you. By the end of it, you'll have the tools you need to speak on any IELTS topic. So it's worth watching if there's something you struggle with. Again, thanks for watching till the end. Until next time.